Texas!
Thanks for coming, Ryan. I appreciate it. And I wonder if you could first tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll get into the really interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So yeah, my background, I grew up in Arizona, and I have a bachelor's degree in Spanish linguistics. So a couple of years after my graduation, I found a job working as a content moderator on behalf of Facebook. So it's kind of weird how I came across the job, because it wasn't listed as a job for Facebook. I didn't know it was Facebook until I got hired, actually. But I ended up being a content moderator for Facebook for about 2 years.
Oh, really? Now that's really interesting, because a lot of us who write and talk, we are on Facebook or LinkedIn or other social media platforms, and now we're getting the idea that it's going somewhere where somebody's looking at it, or some algorithm is looking at it, and potentially censoring us. Whereas I never gave that any thought. I used to look at this as just the way you would using the telephone. It was there and nobody was paying attention. So you can actually tell us a little bit of what goes on sort of behind the scenes. I think everybody would be interested in knowing that.
Yeah, and then a lot of people want to know what's happening with their content. Why did I get my post deleted? Was it an AI? And it's a mixture of things. So part of our job was to train the AI, but part of our job also was to study the policy, the community guidelines that Facebook has, and we had a different internal policy for that. But we would get jobs dumped into our queue. So sometimes the AI would scour Facebook and then dump certain jobs into our queue that we would review one at a time.
AI, you mean artificial intelligence, or what?
Yeah, artificial intelligence or AI. They would scour Facebook for certain keywords, and they could pick and choose which jobs they would want to have manually reviewed by a human.
I see.
So we were the human reviewers, but they could use the AI, the artificial intelligence, in conjunction with the human moderators. Monitor and censor election-related content, political content.
How does that work? What were your guidelines, or who did it? And are some people better at it than others? It seems very strange. Yeah,
so like on an average day, a content moderator like myself would review about 200 pieces of content a day. Now, as far as the election trends, we were given training decks. So they would say, hey, we have an election coming up in Canada. These are the candidates that you'll be seeing. And so we were supposed to raise up any trends to Facebook, but also enforcing election law. So if somebody was spreading misinformation and saying, Republicans vote on Tuesday, Democrats on Wednesday, we would flag that content and delete it and let Facebook know. But they also wanted urgent visibility into certain aspects of the elections. So they wanted urgent visibility into the Democrat debates where Hillary Clinton was debating. And they also told us to flag right-wing extremism globally and raise up those instances. We were flagging trends like the Boogaloo or Trump's impeachment. So these are all examples of things that Facebook is doing. But why is Facebook enforcing these election laws? Who gave Facebook authority to enforce election law, right?
Well, see, there's also an issue of just the fact of censorship, that you have effectively a company providing a public service, ultimately, and they decide what will be allowed and what won't.
Yeah.
And it is a censorship of the sort that we, at least someone my age, used to associate with the old Soviet Union, with East Germany, or today's communist China.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Yeah, it is tough. So, and you mentioned the Soviet Union, and the co-author of my book, Kent Heckenlively, he has a great theory on that, because you look at the time of the 80s and Reagan and how he dealt with the Soviet Union, they thought we were the bad guys, right? So I think we should use the same approach with Facebook. I think they're in this enclave in San Francisco, this bubble, and they really think that we're the enemy, that right-leaning people are the enemy. So maybe we can approach it that way. But they do have this censorship power, which was given to them by Congress, which who knows if Congress even had that authority to give in the first place. So just so we're clear, Section 230 from 1996 is a civil liability protection. It has nothing to do with the First Amendment. It's a civil liability protection. So yeah, Facebook has that, and they're abusing it. It's supposed to be used in the letter of the law as a Good Samaritan protection, where they can restrict content that's lewd or inappropriate. So gross negligence is not being a Good Samaritan. And we see, in the news here with Trump's recent lawsuit against Twitter and Facebook. So his argument is basically, look, Facebook and Twitter, they're acting as state actors. So we have to prove, is the government giving Facebook permission to do this, or are they directing them to do that? So that's a huge difference. If I give you permission, Grant, to go knock over that table, okay, you can go do it if you want. But if I say, Grant, go knock over that table, I'm directing you, I'm giving you instructions to do that. So that's what the Trump's case hinges on. It's a very poorly understood law. I think it's outdated. We've had such advances in technology that have helped us in a lot of ways as society. We've grown financially as a country. It's great to have these big tech companies, this technology at our fingertips. But we see that it is being abused to censor political viewpoints. There are some different legal theories as far as approaching this whole issue. A friend of mine named Jason Fick, FYK, he's been suing Facebook for the last 2 years. He had a case that went to the Supreme Court in January. They chose not to hear it. So the premise of his new approach now is suing not Facebook and Twitter, but actually suing the United States government directly under the Fifth Amendment for due process. Because Facebook, when they censor your post, Grant, or they limit your distribution, they're depriving you of liberty and property, because your content you post is your property, in a sense. So so there's really no measurable bounds that Facebook is giving. It's too vague. There's a void of vagueness principle. So yeah, once again, Congress delegated this authority to Facebook and Twitter and big tech, and they're abusing it. And we should be able to sue the United States government for doing this in the first place, because we don't have due process. We don't have a recourse to have our content restored. We don't have a recourse to sue Facebook.
We also see the opportunity for political misuse. Not just see the opportunity, you see it happening.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you can give one side of the political spectrum sort of free rein, and you shut down the other side, you tip the balance in a fair election.
Yeah.
Obviously. And that seems to me like a pretty serious thing to do. It also leads to a certain self-censorship on the part of people who don't want to be censored or blocked or cancelled.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to me that this is a sort of telling ghost stories, but it's really something that's here and now, and a huge threat actually to consensual government. And it can work both ways.
Yeah, the effect on the government is fascinating, and knowing your background, Grant, with the foreign service and working in foreign countries, it's really fascinating. So I actually started at Facebook as a content moderator for Latin America. So I was reviewing content in Spanish, and I saw a lot of content involving Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, and these are a lot of countries where there's essentially dictators in power, and they've been using Facebook as a tool to manipulate people to promote their agenda. And we've had other Facebook whistleblowers expose this, data scientists expose this, and for Facebook it wasn't a priority. Clearly, the U.S. election was a priority for Facebook. But for example, in Venezuela, I have a specific post, an example, and it's in my book, Behind the Mask of Facebook, where in Venezuela, someone was calling for an armed revolution in Venezuela, and Facebook said to delete that post. So it just goes to show how much influence they do have in foreign countries, in elections, in the governance in general. So, and just this last weekend, we had a July 4th weekend, and the hashtag revolution was actually banned by Facebook. If you tried to look it up, you couldn't find anything with the hashtag revolution. So I think it's ironic that Congress gave this authority to Facebook, and here's Facebook censoring patriotic posts over the July 4th weekend. But once again, I had access to election training decks globally. So I had training decks in Poland, Korea, I believe, I'm fairly certain South Korea, Taiwan, where Facebook is basically just training their content moderators, making them aware of social issues in each country. Now that can be a good thing, but knowing a Facebook slant to the left, it can be dangerous if they're meddling in elections and influencing elections.
I'll say in Taiwan a couple of years ago in their election, we had a candidate come out of Kaohsiung in the south. He was a nobody had heard of him. And a PRC, a Chinese communist-driven sort of online campaign, actually brought him to the forefront, elected him mayor. And in the next election, he ran for president of Taiwan. And he could have won.
Yeah.
And it shows just what can be done. And I suspect Facebook didn't help out much for the forces of democracy.
Yeah.
But what would you recommend we do about this?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
It is a big policy issue.
Yeah.
And it really goes to the fundamental nature of what we think of the freedom we have in America to say what we feel like, to think what we want.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what do you think we should do?
So we can do two things right now. I think right now it's important to focus on state and local legislation against big tech. So Florida and Texas have passed legislation about that, saying, hey, you can't censor. Facebook shouldn't be able to deplatform political candidates. That's a good start. And then also the second thing we should be doing is diversifying. So, we should be choosing alternate platforms like Gab. We just found there's a new one this week, I think, called Getter. There's MeWe. There's a whole plethora of other competing social media companies, websites. So yeah, feel free to use those. Diversify. That's something else we can do as consumers. I mean, obviously it's hard to fight against these monopolies, which I would argue they are monopolies. But yeah, I think we should focus on local state legislation, and then just continue as consumers to make good choices about our social media use.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I would encourage everyone to read Ryan's book. It's be a good one. It'll be your first step, actually, if you want to fix this. But I appreciate you taking the time. Yeah. And it's very interesting. It's troubling, of course. Yeah. We'll see how it turns out. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Grant.
My pleasure. Yeah.